In December 1932, a 27-year-old mathematician sat alone in a small room in Warsaw's Saxon palace. He had been given a codebook covering 2 months, September and October 1932, obtained from a spy inside the German cryptographic service, and 6 weeks to do what France and Britain, with all their resources and trained minds, had spent years failing to do. There is one country that had not given up. Poland shares a border with Germany. Poland had been reading German military intentions as a matter of national survival since 1918. And in the autumn of 1932, the Polish Cipher Bureau assigned Marian Rejewski to work alone, in secret, on the problem that had defeated everyone else. On the last night of that year, while Warsaw rang in the new year, he solved it. The German Enigma cipher. 158 quintillion possible daily settings, cracked in 6 weeks by a man most of you have never heard of, 7 years before Alan Turing. He handed everything to Britain 5 weeks before the war began, the rotor wirings, the blueprints, the working replica machines, all of it, for free. Britain took it, improved it, and produced the intelligence operation that helped win the war. And then the world made a film about Alan Turing. Everyone knows that story. A brilliant, eccentric British mathematician arrives at a Victorian mansion in the Buckinghamshire countryside. He builds a machine. The machine breaks the Nazi cipher. The war is shortened. Millions of lives are saved. The man is prosecuted by his own government for who he loves, chemically castrated, and dies alone at 41 with a half-eaten apple beside him. It is a story of genius and injustice. It is also, in its most popular form, profoundly incomplete. The myth is not that Alan Turing was brilliant. He was. The myth is not that Bletchley Park changed the war. It did. The myth is that the breaking of Enigma was a British achievement that began in 1939, when the government code and cipher school moved into that mansion at Bletchley Park and set the finest mathematical minds in Britain to work on Germany's cipher. That version of events has been told so many times through so many documentaries and films and museum exhibits that it is calcified into fact. And the reason it feels so complete is that it contains so much that is genuinely true. Turing did design the bomb, the electromechanical machine that automated the search for Enigma's daily settings. The first bomb, named Victory, was delivered to Bletchley Park on March 14, 1940, built by the British Tabulating Machine Company. By the end of the war, 211 bomb machines were operational, crewed by 1,676 female WRNS operators and 263 male RAF personnel, processing between 3,000 and 5,000 intercepted German messages every single day. The intelligence product, codenamed Ultra, reached the desks of Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, and Bernard Montgomery. Sir Harry Hinsley, Bletchley's official historian, later concluded that Ultra shortened the war in Europe by not less than 2 years, and probably by 4. These are not small things. They are enormous things, and Turing sits at the center of them. But here is what the myth requires you not to ask. Where did Turing's bomb come from? The answer is Warsaw. When Turing arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, he did not begin from zero. He began from a blueprint, the mathematical framework for attacking Enigma, the understanding of its rotor wirings, its structural weaknesses, its exploitable procedural errors, had already been worked out. A working electromechanical machine for breaking the daily settings had already been built. The techniques that would underpin every British code-breaking success of the war had already been developed, tested, and proven. Not in Buckinghamshire, in the Saxon palace in Warsaw. Not in 1939, in 1932. The myth endures for a simple reason. The men who built the foundation were Polish. Their country was invaded and occupied. Their work was classified for decades, and when the secrets of Bletchley Park were finally released in the 1970s, the story that emerged was told from a British archive, in English, about British achievements. The forerunners had been written out before anyone started writing. The Polish Cipher Bureau did not recruit the way Britain recruited. There were no country house interviews, no chess champions summoned by telegram, no eccentric dons recommended by Cambridge colleagues over dinner. The Bureau found its mathematicians the way a country that has been invaded, partitioned, and erased from the map for 123 years finds everything it needs. By being more systematic, more urgent, and more clear-eyed about the threat than anyone else in Europe. In early 1929, Captain Maksymilian Rejewski, head of the Bureau's German section, approached Poznan University with a specific request. He wanted mathematics students, not linguists, not classicists, mathematicians, and they had to speak German fluently, which in Poznan was not remarkable, because this corner of Poland had been German territory until 1918, and the local population had grown up bilingual by necessity. 26 students enrolled in a secret cryptology course run by the Bureau. The course lasted several months. Only 6 completed it. At the top of that cohort were 3 names: Henryk Zygalski, Jerzy Różycki, and Marian Rejewski. On September 1st, 1932, all 3 joined the Cipher Bureau as civilian employees, working at the Saxon Palace in Warsaw. Rejewski was 27, Różycki was 23, Zygalski was 25. Between them, they had no intelligence experience, no cryptanalytic field record, and no access to the machine they were being asked to break. What they had was pure mathematical ability, and a quality of mind that Rejewski had understood correctly was more useful than anything else. Marian Rejewski had grown up in Bydgoszcz, a city that had been under Prussian and then German administration until the end of the First World War. His father was a tobacco merchant. Nothing in his background suggested he would become the most consequential cryptanalyst of the 20th century. What his background gave him was fluency in German, an education that ran straight into permutation group theory at Poznan University, and a habit of thinking about problems structurally, not as puzzles to be solved by intuition, but as systems whose internal logic could be exposed through mathematics. The Enigma machine that Rejewski was handed the task of breaking in late October 1932 was not a mystery in all respects. The Bureau already had a commercial version of the device. Enigma had been patented in 1918 by a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius and sold openly to businesses throughout the 1920s. What made the military version different and what made it so resistant to attack was the plug board, a panel of socket connections at the front of the machine that scrambled the alphabet an additional time before the signal even reached the rotors. The commercial Enigma had no plug board. The military Enigma, which the German armed forces had been using in its plug board-equipped form since 1930, was a categorically more complex device. Rejewski had the commercial machine. He had mathematical intuition about how the military version must have been modified. And he had one additional resource that the French and British had possessed and still failed to exploit. French military intelligence, specifically Section D of the Deuxième Bureau, under an officer named Gustave Bertrand, had recruited a spy inside the German cryptographic service. His name was Hans Thilo Schmidt. Between 1931 and 1932, Schmidt had passed Bertrand documents that included Enigma operating manuals and the actual daily key settings for September and October 1932. Bertrand shared this material with the Poles. He had also shared it with British intelligence. Britain looked at the documents and concluded they were insufficient to break the machine. They were right that the documents alone were insufficient. They were wrong about what a sufficiently gifted mathematician could do with them as a starting point. Around December 10, 1932, Rejewski received the Schmidt material. He had already been working on the problem for 6 weeks, building equations from pure mathematical deduction. The documents allowed him to reduce the number of unknowns in his permutation equations to a solvable set. He worked through December in the small room assigned to him, telling no one, not even Zygalski and Różycki, what he was doing. On December 31st, 1932, he solved it. But solving it once was not the same as reading it every day. Enigma's operators changed the machine's settings at midnight. Every 24 hours, the entire mathematical problem reset. What Rejewski had proven was that the cipher could be broken. What he and his colleagues now had to build was a system for breaking it continuously, day after day, month after month, as Germany kept upgrading the machine and changing its procedures. What they built over the next 7 years was extraordinary. Rejewski invented the cyclometer, a device that cataloged the characteristics of all 17,576 possible rotor settings across 6 possible rotor orders, producing a card catalog that could be used to identify the daily settings from intercepted traffic. When Germany changed its procedures in 1938, he developed the bomba, an electromechanical machine consisting of 6 linked Enigma replicas that could search for the correct rotor settings automatically, cracking the daily key in approximately 2 hours. Zygalski devised perforated sheets, large paper grids that, when overlaid in the correct combination, could isolate the day's settings through a process of elimination. Różycki developed the clock method, a technique for determining which rotor was in the rightmost position. These were not approximations or partial solutions. The Polish Cipher Bureau was reading German military Enigma traffic regularly by 1933. They continued reading it, through German upgrades, procedural changes, and the addition of new rotors, for the better part of 7 years. And then, on July 25, 1939, 5 weeks before Germany invaded Poland and 6 years before the war ended, they gave everything away. At a conference at Pyry in the Kabaki forest just south of Warsaw, Rejewski, Zygalski, and Różycki sat down with French and British representatives and handed over the complete record of their work. The rotor wirings, the bomba design, the Zygalski sheets, the card catalog, the mathematical framework for the entire thing. The British representative who received this briefing went back to London and described what he had seen as a stupefying experience. He had arrived expecting to share knowledge. He left having received it. The first surprise was not what the British found at Pyry. It was what they had failed to find themselves. When Dilly Knox, Britain's most gifted cryptanalyst, a man who had been attacking Enigma since the early 1930s, received the Polish briefing on July 25, 1939, he learned something that should have been impossible. The rotor wiring of the military Enigma, the internal electrical connections that determined how each letter was scrambled, had been worked out by a 27-year-old mathematician in Warsaw using permutation group theory and 6 weeks of concentrated algebraic reasoning. Knox had been trying to determine the same wiring for years. He had not managed it. Rejewski had done it in late 1932, alone, without seeing the machine, working only from the mathematical structure of intercepted traffic and 2 months of stolen key settings provided by a French spy. The reason Knox had failed where Rejewski succeeded came down to a single assumption. Knox had assumed that the military Enigma, like the commercial version he had studied, connected its keyboard to its entry rotor in alphabetical order. A to the first contact, B to the second, and so on. It was a reasonable assumption. It was wrong. The military Enigma connected the keyboard in the order the letters appeared on a German typewriter keyboard, Q, W, E, R, T, Z, and so on. Rejewski, who had grown up in formerly German Poznan and thought naturally in German keyboard layouts, had tried the typewriter sequence almost instinctively. The equations resolved immediately. One assumption. 7 years of difference. But this was only the beginning of what the Pyry conference revealed. Because the Poles had not merely solved the wiring, they had built a functioning replica of the military Enigma, manufactured in secret by the AVA radio manufacturing company in Warsaw. and they brought 2 of these replicas to the meeting and gave 1 each to the French and British delegations. The British had been trying to reconstruct the military enigma from first principles. The Poles handed them a working copy. When Turing arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, 6 weeks after Pyre, he did not begin the attack on Enigma from zero. He began with the Polish rotor wirings, the Polish mathematical framework, and the conceptual architecture of the Polish bomba already in his hands. His own bomba, the machine that would eventually run to 211 units and process thousands of messages daily, was a direct evolution of Rejewski's design, extended and improved by Turing's insight and Gordon Welchman's diagonal board enhancement. The Polish bomba had used 6 Enigma replicas linked together. Turing's bomb used 36 scramblers arranged in 3 banks of 12, stood 2 meters tall, 2 meters long, and 1 meter wide, and was built by the British Tabulating Machine Company. What Turing built was genuinely brilliant. What made it possible to build it all had been worked out in Warsaw 7 years and 3 months earlier on the last night of 1932. But the Polish contribution did not end at Myri. That is the second thing history forgot. The story the world tells about Bletchley Park tends to treat July 25, 1939, as a handover, the moment Poland passed the baton and stepped out of the race. In this version, the Poles gave Britain the starting blocks, and Britain ran the rest of the race alone. What that version omits is what happened to Rejewski, Zygalski, and Różycki after the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, and what they continued to produce under conditions that make Bletchley Park's secluded Victorian mansion look like a spa retreat. The second surprise was where the work continued. When German forces crossed the Polish border, the Cipher Bureau evacuated Warsaw. Rejewski and his colleagues fled southeast, crossed into Romania, and made their way through the Balkans to France. By late October 1939, less than 2 months after their country had been invaded and occupied, all 3 men were back at work, now at a secret facility codenamed P.C. Bruno, located at the Château de Vignoles at Gretz-Armenvillers, 25 miles northeast of Paris. Working alongside French cryptanalysts, they continued breaking German Enigma traffic through the entire period of the phony war. They were reading German military communications while their homeland was under occupation. They were cracking the daily settings of the machine they had broken 7 years earlier while their families were behind enemy lines, and they were doing it without the resources, the infrastructure, or the institutional support that Bletchley Park had in abundance. When France fell in June 1940, they moved again, this time to North Africa, then back to the unoccupied zone of southern France, where they continued working under the codename Cadix until November 1942, when German forces occupied Vichy France and the operation had to be abandoned for the final time. Jerzy Różycki never made it out. On January 9, 1942, the ship carrying him back from a liaison mission in Algiers sank in the western Mediterranean. He was 32 years old. His body was never recovered. Rejewski and Zygalski eventually reached Britain in 1943, crossing through Spain, where they were briefly imprisoned, and arriving via Gibraltar. They were inducted into the Polish army and put to work at a signals facility in Boxmoor, Hertfordshire, breaking German SS and SD hand ciphers. They were not invited to Bletchley Park. The reason given was security. Having been in occupied France, it was judged too risky to bring them into the ultra-secret. This may have been true. It may also have been convenient. What is certain is that the 2 men who had done more than anyone alive to make Bletchley Park's work possible spent the rest of the war in a secondary facility, breaking lesser ciphers, unknown to the British public and unacknowledged by the institution their work had built. Another surprise, and the one that reframes everything, is what the Polish intelligence gift actually contained that Britain initially failed to exploit. When Turing received the Polish bomba design in 1939, he recognized immediately that it would not survive the procedural change Germany was about to make. The original Polish bomba worked because German operators were required to encipher their three-letter message key twice at the start of every transmission, a six-letter sequence that created a mathematically exploitable repetition. Rejewski had built his entire attack around this weakness. On May 10, 1940, the day Germany launched its offensive against France and the Low Countries, the Germans discontinued the doubled message key procedure entirely. The Polish bomba was rendered obsolete overnight. But here is what this moment reveals about the nature of the Polish contribution that is almost never stated plainly. The bomba had not merely been a machine. It had been a proof of concept. It had demonstrated that a mechanical device could search Enigma's key space faster than human analysis. It had established the logical architecture, the use of cribs, the elimination of contradictory settings, the systematic narrowing of possibilities, that Turing now applied to a completely new design. Turing's bomb worked differently from the Polish bomba. Where Rejewski's machine had exploited the doubled key indicator, Turing's exploited cribs, known or guessed fragments of plaintext matched against ciphertext to identify contradictions. Gordon Welchman's edition of the diagonal board, implemented in the second bomb design, named Agnus Dei and delivered to Bletchley Park in August 1940, multiplied the machine's efficiency dramatically by exploiting the symmetrical properties of Enigma's plugboard. These were genuine British innovations built on Polish foundations. The distinction matters. So does the sequence. For every bomb that Bletchley Park eventually ran, and by the war's end, there were 211 of them operating around the clock at outstations in Adstock, Gayhurst, and Wavendon, as well as at Bletchley itself. The logical chain of development ran back to a card catalogue that Rejewski built in Warsaw in 1933, a cyclometer he constructed to index 17,576 rotor positions, and a bomba he designed in 1938 that could crack the daily Enigma settings in under 2 hours. For every ultra-decrypt that reached Churchill's desk, and by 1944, Bletchley was successfully reading the vast majority of intercepted Enigma traffic across all German military networks. The mathematical framework that made decryption possible had been established not by Turing, not by Welchman, not by any of the chess champions and crossword solvers recruited to the Buckinghamshire mansion, but by 3 young mathematicians from Poznan who built their attack in secret under existential pressure 7 years before the war began. The forerunners did not merely contribute to the breaking of Enigma. They made it possible. Everything else was acceleration. Take away the narrative. Strip away the names and the dates and the drama of men fleeing across Europe with stolen blueprints. What remains is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not lie. The German Enigma machine, in the configuration used by the Wehrmacht from 1930 onwards, offered its operators a theoretical number of possible daily settings that has been calculated at approximately 158 quintillion. Written out, that number is 158 followed by 18 zeros. It is larger than the estimated number of grains of sand on every beach on Earth. It is why French intelligence abandoned their attack. It is why British intelligence concluded the machine was unbreakable. It is the number that makes what Marian Rejewski did in 6 weeks in late 1932 almost incomprehensible. He did not try all the settings. He collapsed the problem mathematically. Using permutation group theory, he reduced 158 quintillion possibilities to a solvable set of equations. And then he solved them. The plugboard alone, which scrambled the alphabet before the signal even reached the rotors, produced 150 trillion possible connection combinations when set to swap 6 pairs of letters, as the early military procedure required. By 1938, the Germans had increased the number of swapped letter pairs from 6 to 10, raising the plugboard combinations to over 150 quintillion on their own. The number of possible rotor orders, once Germany introduced 2 additional rotors in December 1938, bringing the available set to 5, expanded from 6 possible arrangements to 60. The Poles needed 60 bombs and 60 complete sets of Zygalski sheets to attack this upgraded system. Their budget could not cover it. The modifications introduced on December 15, 1938 and January 1, 1939 in rapid succession effectively shut down the Polish attack at the moment the threat was becoming most acute. This is the number that explains Peary. The Poles did not share their work in July 1939 out of sentiment or generosity. They shared it because they had reached the limit of what they could do alone against a machine that Germany was making harder every year, with resources that a small nation squeezed between 2 hostile powers could not indefinitely sustain. Britain had the industrial capacity. Britain had the facilities. Britain had Bletchley Park's 58 acres, its growing staff, and the backing of a government that understood, by the summer of 1939, exactly what was at stake. What Britain did with the Polish inheritance was scale it. The numbers tell that story too. By March 1940, 1 bomba was operational at Bletchley Park. By the end of 1940, there were 16. By the end of 1941, there were 95. By the war's end, 211 bomba machines were running across multiple outstations, each containing 36 scrambler units, each standing 2 meters tall and weighing approximately 1 ton. The manufacturing effort involved the British Tabulating Machine Company's entire production capacity and thousands of hours of precision engineering. During 1940 alone, the 2 prototype bombas broke 178 Enigma keys. By 1944, Bletchley Park was intercepting and processing between 3,000 and 5,000 German messages every single day. The intelligence product flowing from those decrypts reached the desks of every senior Allied commander in every theater of the war. For every day that Bletchley Park read German military traffic, the Poles had already been reading it for up to 7 years. For every bomba drum that spun searching for the day's settings, it turned on a mathematical principle first established in Warsaw. For every ultra-decrypt that shaped an Allied operational decision, from the Battle of the Atlantic to the invasion of Normandy, the chain of cryptanalytic logic ran back to a single evening in a palace in Warsaw on December 31, 1932. Rejewski received £7 in cash from the Polish government when he finally escaped to Britain in 1943. Not £7,000, not £70,000, £7. The compensation offered to the man whose 6 weeks of algebra in 1932 had started a chain of events that would produce the most consequential intelligence operation in the history of warfare. Gordon Welchman, whose diagonal board enhancement transformed the efficiency of Turing's bomb, received a CBE after the war. Turing received an OBE. Rejewski received a low-grade position at a signals facility in Hertfordshire, breaking SS hand ciphers, and was not invited to Bletchley Park. The open question hanging over this entire story is the one that skeptics always reach for. Even if the Poles did it first, did it actually matter? Britain built the bombs. Britain ran ultra. Britain won the intelligence war. What difference does the origin point make to the outcome? The answer is buried in the operational record of a single engagement. Not the Battle of the Atlantic, not Normandy. A smaller, earlier, more precise proof. The breaking of the Luftwaffe's Red Key in the spring and summer of 1940, which saved the RAF during the Battle of Britain. And the proof hinges entirely on timing. By May 1940, Bletchley Park had been operational for 8 months. The Polish rotor wirings, the replica Enigma machines, and the conceptual architecture of the bomba had been in British hands since July 1939. Turing's first bomb victory had been delivered on March 14, 1940. A second design, Agnus Dei, incorporating Welchmann's diagonal board, arrived in August 1940. The same month, the Luftwaffe began its systematic campaign to destroy RAF Fighter Command. From mid-1940, Bletchley Park was reading German Air Force Enigma signals, the Red Key, with sufficient regularity to provide Fighter Command with advance intelligence on Luftwaffe intentions, targeting priorities, and order of battle. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command from his headquarters at Bentley Priory in Stanmore, received ultra-intelligence that informed his decisions about where to deploy his desperately limited squadrons. Britain had, in the summer of 1940, approximately 650 operational Spitfires and Hurricanes against a Luftwaffe that was putting over 2,500 aircraft into the battle. The margin was obvious. Every decision about where to concentrate defense, which airfields to prioritize, which German formations were feints and which were the main effort, carried consequences measured in aircraft and pilots that could not be replaced quickly enough. Without the ability to read Luftwaffe signals, Dowding was navigating that margin blind. With it, he was navigating it with partial but genuine foreknowledge. Now apply the question of timing. Bletchley Park began reading the Red Key consistently from mid-1940. That capability existed because the Polish rotor wirings allowed Turing to build a bomb that worked. The first bomb arrived in March 1940. The Polish briefing that made it possible happened in July 1939. If Pyry had not happened, if Rejewski, Zygalski, and Różycki had not walked into that conference with working Enigma replicas and 7 years of mathematical groundwork, Bletchley Park in the summer of 1940 would have been starting from a position British cryptanalysts had occupied since the early 1930s, which was nowhere. Dilly Knox had spent years on the problem and had not cracked the rotor wiring. Without the Polish solution, Britain enters the Battle of Britain still working on the fundamental problem that Rejewski solved in 1932. The Battle of Britain ran from July 10th to October 31st, 1940. The margin by which Fighter Command survived it, the margin that kept Britain in the war, that preserved the island base from which D-Day would eventually be launched, was thin enough that historians still argue about how close Germany came to winning it. Ultra did not win the Battle of Britain alone. Radar, the operations room network, the courage of the aircrew, and Luftwaffe strategic miscalculations all contributed. But Ultra was part of the defensive architecture that held, and Ultra in the summer of 1940 existed because 3 Polish mathematicians had handed Britain a solution to a problem it had not been able to solve itself. Remember that Sir Harry Hinsley, Bletchley Park's official historian, wrote in his authoritative 5-volume history, British Intelligence in the Second World War, that without the Polish contribution, the attack on Enigma would have been delayed by at least 2 years. The Battle of Britain was fought in the summer of 1940. 2 years later was 1942. The Poles did not just contribute to the breaking of Enigma. They made it available in time. The most compelling confirmation of what the Polish cryptanalysts achieved does not come from Allied archives or post-war British assessments. It comes from the Germans themselves. Wilhelm Flicke was a senior signals intelligence officer in the German Army's signal monitoring service, the Funkabwehr, throughout the Second World War. After Germany's defeat, he wrote a detailed account of German signals intelligence operations titled War Secrets in the Ether, completed in 1952 and later declassified by American intelligence. Flicke had spent the war on the other side of the cipher war, monitoring Allied communications, assessing German encryption security, and attempting to understand how the enemy was obtaining intelligence that it should not have possessed. Flicke's conclusion was that the Germans had made a fatal error in assuming that Enigma's mathematical complexity guaranteed its security. The machine, he noted, had been considered so secure that procedural discipline among operators was allowed to deteriorate. Operators reused settings. They chose predictable message keys. They sent stereotyped openings that became the cribs Bletchley Park exploited. The Germans, Flicka wrote, trusted the machine absolutely and thereby handed its attackers the leverage they needed. But Flick's most pointed observation concerned not Bletchley Park, but its predecessors. He identified the Polish cipher bureau's work in the 1930s as the critical breach, the moment when Enigma's theoretical invincibility was first converted into practical vulnerability. The mathematical reconstruction of the rotor wirings, he wrote, represented an intelligence achievement of the first order, accomplished against a machine whose operators had been assured was beyond cryptanalytic reach. The Germans never discovered during the war that Enigma had been broken. Post-war investigations by German signals officers, including a formal review conducted in 1945 as the Reich collapsed, attributed Allied foreknowledge to spies, to captured documents, to radio direction finding, to everything except the correct answer. The idea that the cipher itself had been mathematically penetrated and that the penetration had begun not in wartime Britain but in peacetime Poland in 1932 was not seriously entertained. That was precisely how thoroughly Rejewski, Zygalski, and Różycki had done their work. The Germans spent the entire war trusting a machine that had been broken before the war began. They trusted it to the end. Come back to that room in the Saxon palace. December 31st, 1932. A 27-year-old mathematician from Bydgoszcz, sitting alone with his equations while Warsaw prepares to celebrate the new year. Marian Rejewski solved the problem that night. He did not tell anyone immediately. He went back to work the next morning. That is the whole story, really. Not the films, not the mansion in Buckinghamshire, not the dramatic race against time with German U-boats closing in. The whole story is a quiet man in a cold room doing something that every expert said could not be done, and then continuing to do it every day for 7 more years while his country was invaded, while his colleague drowned in the Mediterranean, while he fled through Spain and sat in a prison cell and eventually arrived in Britain to break lesser ciphers in a secondary facility while the institution his work had built ran without him 20 miles away. He never complained publicly. He never sought recognition. He returned to Poland after the war and worked in obscurity for companies in Bydgoszcz until poor health forced his retirement in 1966. He died in Warsaw on February 13, 1980, having spent the final years of his life writing quiet technical papers about the mathematics he had used 4 decades earlier. The lesson is not complicated. The people who actually change things are not always the people history decides to remember. Sometimes the foundation is poured in the dark by hands nobody photographs, and the building that rises on top of it gets all the attention. If that story moved you, and we hope it did, please take a moment to like this video. This script took long hours of research, cross-referencing archives, declassified intelligence documents, and post-war testimonies in 3 languages to get right. Every like tells YouTube that serious, carefully researched history still finds an audience. Every subscription means we can keep doing it. Marian Rejewski spent decades unrecognized. The least we can do is make sure that changes. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We go back into the archives every single week for people like him, the ones who poured the foundation while someone else got the building named after them. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. These stories only survive if people care enough to pass them on. Thank you for being one of those people.